participated in prior webinars, recordings, as Kit mentioned, of those webinars are available on the Council's website for this second Fishery Ecosystem Plan initiative. Following today's webinar, the Ecosystem Work Group is going to be working on a report on this series for the Council's March briefing book. And our intent for that report is to summarize these webinars, possibly with some of our thoughts on future directions for ecosystem status reports. We'll be providing some ideas and guidance for Council advisory bodies and the public on reviewing the webinars and annual report so that they can in turn advise the Council on how and whether the information in the annual report might be revised to better serve their fishery management responsibilities. The work group is going to meet in Sacramento on March 8th at the start of the Council meeting, when we expect to have a more detailed discussion on some of these issues. We're hoping that our work for March will help everyone else better understand where and how to focus their own comments on the Ecosystem Indicators Initiative for June or September. So, in last Thursday's webinar, we ventured beyond familiar indicators from past year's status reports to consider habitat indicators. Today, we're moving into more new territory, discussing risk assessments and applying indicators to decision making. The Science Centers wanted us to think a bit ahead as to how information that we've been hearing about could be pulled together to tell us more about the overall status of the California current ecosystem and some of its major components. So as you're listening, maybe try to think about what you want to know about how all the puzzle pieces we've heard about in these webinars might fit together and influence each other. Today, we'll hear about some of the ways to bring some of those puzzle pieces together from Dr. Jameal Samhouri, leader of the Nearshore Marine Ecology Team in the Northwest Fisheries Science Center's Conservation Biology Division, and from Dr. Elliott Hazen, research ecologist with Southwest Fisheries Science Center's Environmental Research Division. So with that, Kit, if you would please turn over the controls to Jameal and Elliott, we'll all be looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Thank you.
Okay, I just turned over the screen to Jameal. And we are seeing your computer screen, so good to go.
Great, and can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Yep. Great. Well, then let's get started. I have the unfortunate designation of being in control of the slides today, so bear with us as Elliott and I try to tag team this presentation. We're delighted to have this opportunity to present our work and begin what I hope will be a long-term engagement with the Ecosystem Working Group as well as the broader Council family. It seems like this has been a long time in coming, and we're really eager for feedback and hoping to be as useful as possible. In particular, we hope we can do a better job in this cartoon of elucidating what exactly a risk assessment is and is not. And if we don't by the end of this presentation, then please ask questions. So let's just make sure I can advance. All right, great. So this just gives you a brief overview of where we're going with this presentation. The title of the webinar, as we were told about it, is to focus on risk assessment and contextual indicators, that is how indicators can be used in decision making. We're going to disproportionately favor a focus on risk assessment in the interest of time, but we are eager to chat with everybody at the end of the presentation if you'd like to talk more about the indicators separate from risk. So once we give an overview of what risk assessment is, we're going to move to talking about how risk assessment can be used in a near-term context for decision making. I'll turn the slides over to Elliott at that point, and he'll be talking about assessing multiple risks in a dynamic ocean. Just to flag this, I think the way it relates to the fishery ecosystem plan is in the context of thinking about ecosystem effects of fishery removal. So hopefully that will prove useful. Then after Elliott presents section 2, he'll turn the controls back over to me, and I'll present some preliminary work we're doing on long-term planning for climate change, and in particular looking at the vulnerability of coastal pelagic fish and the fisheries that prosecute them. This one, I think, relates to the fishery ecosystem plan in the sense that it assesses the potential effects of near-term and long-term climate effects on managed species in West Coast fisheries. So after we get through those two main sections, I'll turn the controls over one final time to Elliott, who will wrap up with a brief overview of what we didn't talk about but have done as part of the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment team on the West Coast, and discuss a few horizons for future work and open it up to questions from everyone. So with that, let's get started on section 1. So we were asked to present a little bit about the application of indicators to decision making, and that's a really broad realm and could serve as a webinar in and of itself. The one thing I do want to say is that if we have information about the ecosystem, it could be used in the context of developing harvest guidelines or control rules for fisheries, and I think that is something well worth considering. In the second webinar in this series, Chris Harvey presented a slide that looks something like this, with the example of how sea surface temperature provides a context for sardine management presently. And I think this is really an interesting direction to go and to think about, and in particular to think about the functional relationships between changes in the ecosystem, as in changes in sea surface temperature, as illustrated on the bottom of this slide, and changes in sardine productivity. Now, I may not have the form of this particular relationship right in this slide, but I think one direction that we're going as the part of the IEA team is to try to identify where these sorts of relationships are nonlinear and thresholds exist. Because if thresholds do exist in the ecosystem where you see changes in the productivity of the fisheries that we target or associated habitats, predators, protected species, and so forth, we may want to think about alternative management strategies when you're on one side of the threshold versus the other. At this point, we don't really have many reference points established in the integrated ecosystem assessment outside of reference to historical conditions or long-term anomalies, but it's an ongoing area of active research. So, moving on to risk assessment and vulnerability assessments. Risk is typically defined as the chance within a specified time frame of an adverse event with specific consequences. Now that's the definition the ISO uses. It's in all of the textbooks, ecotoxicological literature, everywhere you look. And one way to frame thinking about that is to consider the different components. So the chance within a time frame. So we're talking about something that's probabilistic. Depending on the nature of the analysis, whether it's qualitative, semi-quantitative, or quantitative, you may or may not be able to get to an actual probability. So as shown in this diagram, sometimes people use exposure as a proxy for the chance within a time frame of something happening. So the increasing exposure increases the chances. Then the other axis, adverse event with specific consequences. To me, that's where people start to think about what are the consequences for the survival, productivity, growth of a stock, for instance. If we're thinking about toxins, we could think about cancer lesion rates when exposed to different contaminants. And that is often approximated using sensitivity, which can be determined in a quantitative way or qualitatively. And so if you take those two things together, that will give you the potential impact. And the third sort of dimension that's worth thinking about on the ecological side is the potential for an organism, a population, or a species to adapt to those changes. So this general framework, I think, is useful for thinking about risk on near-term as well as longer time scales. The other component of risk that I think is really important, especially in thinking back to Carmen Norman's presentation on human dimensions, is capturing social vulnerability and social risk. So thinking about the system not just in terms of its ecology, but also the socioeconomic component. And so what this framework, which is adapted from a figure presented by Marshall and colleagues back in 2013, does is it says that ecological vulnerability can be integrated with measures of resource dependency and adaptive capacity on the human side to determine socioeconomic vulnerability. And so together, if you go from the top of the screen to the bottom, you can go soup to nuts from understanding the ecological risk and how it influences risk to people. So in the medium to long term, that's the direction that the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment team is going, and there's lots of opportunity to help direct us to get there in a way that's most useful to the council needs. So just to give you an example of how exposure and sensitivity can come together to give you an idea of risk, here is an example that Corey Green and colleagues have led looking at risk to groundfish from non-fisheries human activities. So this is a habitat and life stage specific assessment of risk to English sole in 4 different regions in the California current. As you can see here, the Salish Sea, the Northwest Coast, Northern California, and the Southern California Bight. I think the important thing here is to recognize that as you move out on the x-axis in increasing exposure, or up on the y-axis in increasing sensitivity, you're increasing expected risk to English sole. And so highest risk levels are out here, lowest risk levels are in here, and anything along a contour line like this has roughly equivalent risk. So in this example, OA, which is ocean acidification, is expected to pose the greatest risk to English sole in each of the 4 regions. Now, important thing here is what Corey has done and what others of us as part of the IEA team have done in this approach is use this framework as a screening tool. So that is to try to develop a rank risk due to different non-fisheries activities for a species of interest. The next step, of course, would be to take the highest risk activities and try to develop more quantitative approaches to estimate whether that highest risk actually is a high risk in absolute terms or not, and over what particular time scale. So I'm going to hand over to Elliott to start presenting and mute myself, but before I do, I'd like to give everyone an opportunity to ask any questions about the overview of what risk assessment is and what we're thinking about with the contextual indicators.
Do we say going once, going twice?
Going 3 times. I don't see any hands up.
Okay, Elliott, so if you just tell me when to advance the slide, I'd be happy to do that, and you can do all the talking.
Sounds great. Okay, so the next section that I'm going to be talking about is the approach of trying to put together some of the information that you've seen from the previous webinars into a coherent kind of risk analysis framework. And the goal is that this will really follow from the previous webinar. You can go ahead and hit the next slide, Jameal, that Corey presented, where we're working on essentially identifying spatial risks for the CCIA in addition to some of the kind of sensitivity exposure matrices that Jameal just presented. You can click it again if you don't mind. Oops. Sorry, go back. I think one of the images seems to have disappeared. Shoot. Well, you can stick on this one, then I can just talk through it. But basically, one of the things that the sections from the 2013 CCIEA that we did was we used the sensitivity and exposure matrix using both species habitat use data and risk exposure data from Halpern et al. 2009, and then put that together as a function of the sensitivity for each of the species, and the species here being sea turtles and marine mammals and seabirds in the California current. And in doing so, we were able to look at multiple risks, actually a total of about 26 different risks in the California current, and also doing that relative to where the species were distributed in space and time. Nonetheless, this approach kind of provides a static picture, and we wanted to make sure that a lot of our risk analyses were being used in more kind of finer spatial and temporal scales. So go ahead and click again next, Jameal. So this concept, and I'll talk through this a bit, of dynamic ocean management is one that we've has really been gaining a lot of traction recently. Essentially, it's an approach of management that changes in space and time at the scales that are relevant, both for animal movement, but also for human use. But it's not necessarily a data poor system. It actually requires a decent bit of data to run fully. And so at the top left, and you can click through again, Jameal, let's hope this time the animations work. Nope, no, it didn't again. Okay, you can go back again. Sorry, it looks like a lot of the animations are having issues here. But on the left side, we have an example of remotely sensed satellite data to give you an idea of sea surface temperature in the California current. And that gets combined with animal use data in the central figure here. Thank you, Jameal. Where we have the example from the tagging of Pacific predators data set, but then also at least spatial, maybe perhaps static, but ideally dynamic risk map on the right, which is one of the slides that was supposed to appear previously, showing where the sensitivity and exposure is greatest in space. But again, in an ideal world, we would also have the risk in more of a dynamic setting as well. Because a lot of this tagging data is collected once, or survey data is collected, we can use the animal distribution data in combination with the oceanographic data to develop species habitat relationships that can then be used in this dynamic framework. So you can go ahead and click again. And this is a good kind of flow chart showing how this is done. So in the top left, you have the example of the oceanographic features, in this example, frontal zones, which can be combined with marine vertebrate space use. And this can be, as mentioned, from sightings at sea, animal tracking data, potentially autonomous detectors, or many others, and fisheries catch, bycatch is another good example, and then some sort of spatially explicit anthropogenic threat. So I'll give one example of marine shipping, and then another example very briefly about a kind of a bycatch scenario that we're exploring as well. So with the oceanographic data combined with the vertebrate space use, we can develop these biophysical hotspots, essentially where we have underlying features that determine high use by these species of concern. At the same time, the overlap between the species and threat in that sensitivity exposure framework can come up with these key threat hotspots. Put together, this allows you to predict overlaps, which can be done on a static basis, but in the example here, because we have the species habitat relationships, we can do this in a more dynamic framework. And by doing that dynamically and collecting more remotely sensed data in essentially near real time, daily to weekly timescales, we can come up with an approach for risk analysis and in turn real-time management that ends up being much more in near real time. So you can go ahead and click through again, Jameal. So the first example I'm going to talk about is a project called Whale Watch, and this was actually funded by NASA but was in direct collaboration with the California Current IEA. And the goal was to use satellite telemetry data in combination with oceanographic features to develop these habitat-based models of the probability of currents and also density of blue whales in the California current system. And while this isn't a fishery-specific example, it at least highlights how we can use essentially an information on a species distribution with a management concern to identify the risk, again, in near real time. And so we're working closely with both the Southwest Regional Office in addition to academic partners to get a good idea for where these ship strike risks are greatest in the California current. So the example on the bottom right I included is specifically because on the East Coast they have used these historical sightings data from whale watch vessels to move shipping lanes. It took about 25 years of data to move the shipping lanes slightly to the north to avoid this interaction with whales. But at the same time, they also have a suite of dynamic measures in place, such as hydrophones, that can detect calls in near real time from North Atlantic right whales and suggest slowdown speeds to the vessels that are traveling through those shipping lanes. We don't have that same technology yet on the West Coast, and nonetheless, there are these kind of, in this example from the port of Long Beach, there are these differential shipping lanes that the ships can essentially choose which route to take based on their emissions and essentially their port that they're heading to. But in doing so, there are trade-offs to the risks of various marine mammal species. And so this approach that has been undertaken in 2013 was a static approach looking at the trade-offs, but what we wanted to do was see if we had higher resolution predictions, could you get a better idea of where the risks kind of would be greatest or less or least in near real time. So you can go ahead and click through. Again, Jameal. And jumping over, essentially skipping a lot of the methods just because of the time, but I'm happy to talk more about them. The seasonal predictions we came up with show this essentially influx of blue whales into the California current in early summer and then leaving in late fall, which matches pretty much exactly with their normal migration into the California current. And this becomes really important to make sure that we're actually predicting where the whales are when they are actually there. And so this is the approach that we have already developed a web page as part with cooperation from the West Coast Regional Office that will provide these estimates again in near real time to the shipping community and can be used on a voluntary basis to try to avoid the whale ship strikes. So you can go ahead and click again. And so again, the animation didn't quite work, but I'll still walk through this. I wanted to talk a little bit about some fisheries applications that are in development, and I'm not going to focus too heavily on these because we're hoping to have some more information in the briefing book for the upcoming council meeting, but I will still obviously pause and be glad to answer any questions that may come about. But we've been working directly in collaboration again with the regional office and members of the Pacific Fisheries Management Council to look at the long-term spatial, or I should say seasonal spatial closures for the drift gillnet fishery in California coast. An example of the drift gillnet vessel is shown in the top right for those of you unfamiliar, which is probably most of the scientists on the call, not the council members. But nonetheless, this large Pacific leatherback conservation area is closed for a large portion of the year and really limits availability of fished habitat. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to use a combination of tracking data for sea lions and leatherback sea turtles and blue sharks and catch data from swordfish and blue sharks as well to come up with this, what we're calling EcoCast model. And the goal of this model is on the bottom left in blue, we can predict catch of swordfish, again in near real time, with high values or high predicted swordfish catch in blue, dark blue, and low predicted catch in light blue. At the same time, we can predict bycatch risk for the sea turtles, sea lions, and blue sharks, shown in red in the middle panel. And this becomes important because even though I'm showing you the static image here, you can kind of hopefully imagine this changing on a daily basis to see where these kind of risk-reward overlaps are in space and time. And so at the same time, we can use essentially management concern to weight the various pixels by the risk. So if leatherbacks are a particular concern for a given year because there may have been one already caught or there may have been just higher predicted leatherbacks in the California current, you could ratchet that up in the risk map and then produce what's on the right, where you have areas from essentially white to brown that are higher catch to bycatch ratios, an area from light blue to dark blue that are high bycatch to catch ratios. So essentially, this sort of a map can give you in near real time, ideally, preferred fishing areas, or at least predicted preferred fishing areas in brown and less preferred areas in light blue to dark blue. So I think you can go ahead and stay here actually, or click on, or if anyone has any questions, this is also a good time. I'll hand the presentation back over to Jameal, but feel free to jump in if there are any questions.
I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I think, Jameal, you can go ahead.
Okay, sounds good. Just let me know if there are any questions as I get going here, and we can stop and make sure Elliott has a chance to address them. And of course, there'll be time at the end. Okay, so hopefully what Elliott just presented gave you a sense of how we might be able to assess risk to the ecosystem from fishery removals, in particular in that example focusing on the drift gillnet fishery and how it might affect marine mammals and other predators. What I'm going to move to now is talking about how we might assess the potential effects of long-term climate change on coastal pelagic species as well as the fishing vessels that target them. So for this analysis, we focused on marine forage species in the California current because they're both important for supporting food webs along the West Coast as well as many fisheries. Globally, they support the largest fisheries in the world. However, we're not aware of any other efforts to bring together climate forecasts along with exposure and sensitivity estimates for multiple species in this particular geographic domain. And I should pause here and say that while this work was started prior to what's become a national level climate vulnerability assessment, right now NMFS is undergoing a process by which all of the managed species in the country are receiving an assessment similar but not exactly the same as the one I'm going to present here. So the goal is to arrive at an understanding of the rank vulnerability of different species and stocks to climate change. So again, this will be reminiscent of some of the earlier slides. What we're attempting to do is develop an understanding of the exposure of different species to climate change and the sensitivity of those species should they be exposed. Now in this analysis, we used global Earth system model output to estimate the expected change in sea surface temperature and chlorophyll A levels within the geographic range of about 10 different coastal pelagic species on the West Coast. So these are things like squid and smelt and sardine, herring, and so forth. As for sensitivity, there are a number of different ways one might estimate sensitivity ranging from the qualitative to the quantitative. In this analysis, we did something in between. So what we did is we assumed that the broader the geographic range and the broader the range of climatic conditions a species is exposed to in contemporary time right now, then the less sensitive it may be to expected future climate change. And so that's a strong assumption. We've tested it against some other proxies for sensitivity, but that's what we used here and what will be presented on the next slide. And again, like I mentioned on an earlier slide, species that fall towards the origin in this space are expected to have lower vulnerability to climate change, and species that are out here are expected to have higher vulnerability to climate change. Now, for what I'm going to present today, this is all based on a comparison of climatic conditions between 1976 and 2005 and 2071 and 2100. So we're dealing with a pretty long time horizon. I think that's going to become important as I show you how we try to link this to social vulnerability as well. So cutting right to the chase here, the 10 different species that we considered in the California current ecosystem, and each species is located where it fell in terms of its exposure to climate change as predicted by changes in sea surface temperature and chlorophyll by NOAA GFDL's Earth system model, and its sensitivity based on the range of climatic conditions it experiences today. So these, if you remember back from the slide of, I showed on English Soul that Corey Green put together, that you can think about this vulnerability space in terms of contours. So these species in the middle here have roughly similar rank vulnerability to climate change, but for different reasons. So for instance, herring are more exposed to changes in sea surface temperature and climate change, but expected to be less sensitive because of their broad, the broad range of conditions they experience today. In contrast, species up here like anchovy are expected to be less exposed to changes in sea surface temperature and chlorophyll within their range in the California current, but they're experiencing a narrow range as it is today, and so they end up with a similar vulnerability score for a different reason. So that is our estimate of ecological vulnerability to climate change for the coastal pelagic species. There is a ton more details that I'd love to get into if anybody has any questions, but what I'd like to make sure I have a little bit of time for is explaining how we can take that estimate of ecological vulnerability and use it to assess the socioeconomic vulnerability of the forage fish, the coastal pelagic fisheries to climate change. So what I just showed you is something that looks like this. We have species I, J, and K that have different rank vulnerabilities based on their exposure and sensitivity. And what we did is we said that we could estimate the vulnerability as the distance from the origin for a given species, and then assume that that's equivalent to the exposure of a fishery to climate change. That is, the fishery's exposure is based on how much the species they target are expected to be affected by changes in sea surface temperature and chlorophyll. So that leaves the sensitivity axis to evaluate on the social side. And so what we did here, following the precedent set by many others, is evaluated sensitivity based on resource dependence. So those fisheries that derive most of their revenue from a particular species are assumed to be more sensitive to climate change than those species that derive less of the revenue from that stock. So what does that give you? It gives you something that looks like this. Again, the x-axis here is the ecological vulnerability of the forage fish, which becomes the social exposure. And then the y-axis for sensitivity here is the mean proportion of revenue derived from each of these stocks across all the vessels that catch them on the West Coast. And so a couple things jump out to me. We've seen sort of a big movement in herring, which used to be out here in the ecological vulnerability axis, is now over here on the social vulnerability axis. And market squid is sort of a loner up here all by itself, as the one that has the highest social vulnerability to climate change. So that's sort of illustrated by comparing the fish vulnerability here on the left side to the fishery vulnerability here on the right side. So as I say, there's much left to be done in terms of making this analysis a bit more rigorous, as well as determining whether the rank vulnerabilities, as illustrated here, translate to high vulnerability in an absolute sense. One thing that I do think is interesting to consider is whether a species like squid might end up being the gilded seine. That is, if that's a fishery that's highly capitalized at the moment and also highly vulnerable to climate change, what is an appropriate management response? And so this paper that Dawson and colleagues put out a few years ago gives a sense of how you can take estimates in this exposure and sensitivity space and translate them into potential interventions or management strategies. So I think that's it from my section. I'll pause and take any questions right now and then hand over to Elliott for the last 2 or 3 slides.
I see that Fran has her hand up, and I've unmuted you, Fran. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering if there could be just a little bit more of an interpretation of this last slide in terms of management approaches.
Sure. So the reference of the gilded seine comes from some work that's been done by some folks on the East Coast on the lobster fishery, where they refer to the gilded trap. Maybe you've heard about that, but that has to do with the idea that there's been intense capitalization for the lobster fishery and a reduction in diversification of fisheries over there, which, if something were to happen to the lobster fishery, could be have severe social consequences. So here I was borrowing that metaphor to think about the relatively high ecological vulnerability of market squid on the West Coast, combined with the large extent to which squid fishing vessels rely upon squid as a primary source of revenue. Does that clarify things, or would you like me to say more?
I see that Cherise Schmidt has her hand up. Cherise, go ahead.
Thank you, Kit. I have a question about the consideration of individual stocks within a species. The diagrams that you show mention a species, herring versus anchovy versus sardine and so forth, but some of them on the West Coast are thought to have more than one stock, albeit in some cases there's not a lot of, I guess, certainty about the stock structure of some of these species. So I was wondering whether or not the analysis considered just the presence or the distribution of a species as opposed to the stocks in your results.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So just to paraphrase, does this analysis consider a substock structure in of quantifying ecological or social vulnerability to climate change, or could it? And so the answer is no, it doesn't, but yes, I think it could, and that's a potentially really useful direction to go with this approach. And I think that one thing that this analysis might miss is if one of these species that is expected to have lower vulnerability, sorry as I click through here, when you consider this coastwide stock, but is known to have substock structure, it could be that one of those substocks is much more vulnerable than another, and we've missed that here. So I think that's a kind of conversation that would be really useful to have so that we could advance our understanding of vulnerability in a way that's more meaningful for achieving sustainable yields in the long term.
Yeah, thank you.
Fran, you raised your hand again. You have another question?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay, I see that, Deb, you have your hand up, but I'm not sure. You might need to enter your audio pin. I'm not seeing that you're logged into the audio.
While Deb's logging in, may I ask a follow-up question to Cerese's question?
Go ahead.
So I may have missed this in your explanation, Jameal, but when you're talking about the vulnerability of these species, is this vulnerability in terms of their ability to reproduce at certain levels, or the likelihood of their moving to different areas? And I'm thinking of this in connection with what Cerese was asking, because it seems like the Council would probably be interested not just in questions of abundance, but also in questions of distribution.
Yeah, that's a great question, Yvonne. Thanks. And I don't think I did mention it, so I appreciate you giving me the chance to explain myself a little bit more. In the vulnerability assessment presented here, we didn't specify what the expected type of change in each of the stocks would be. In fact, the expected change could be positive or negative, but it's really whether it's going to be a large reaction to climate change. And so I think that would, we could certainly make some guesses as to which of the species are likely to do better or worse with the expected changes in temperature and chlorophyll, but I really think that this approach is best thought of as one that would feed into a more detailed analysis that might model expected changes in things like survival, reproduction, and space use, the geographic distribution, in a more explicit way. And I think that might be where some of the work that Elliott presented on near-time predictions of where species are based on remotely sensed data might connect with some of these medium to longer-term predictions in terms of movement and so forth.
I think that Deb is still struggling with the audio hookup, so why don't we proceed with the presentation, and hopefully Deb can resolve that, or she could email her question to me, and we could pick it up once your presentation is over with.
That sounds good. Are there any other hands raised at this point?
I don't see any others, so let's move on, I guess.
All right, in that case, I'll turn it back over to Elliott for the last couple of slides.
Great. And I just want to say, I think that the question too about stock structure leads in perfectly to kind of what we have in mind for at least some of our activities in the future. This idea of scaling up and scaling down is we fully recognize, and this has largely been because a lot of our stakeholders have told us this as well, that we need to examine finer scales for the CCIA process. In some examples, this has been done. For example, Jameal worked with the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary on a risk analysis at the Monterey Bay scale, and there's been additional efforts or kind of desires to move forward with similar work with the tribes in the Pacific Northwest, where we can look at more regional indicators rather than coast-wide. But currently, this is not something that the IEA is doing as well as it could, and so it's kind of an area for growth, particularly with the risk section moving forward. But at the same time, as part of the reference point working group that Jameal mentioned at the beginning, we are trying to assess these nonlinear changes that might be able to be used to come up with additional control rules. So whether there are ecosystem state changes that should suggest more conservative or maybe even more liberal management approaches based on the response of the ecosystem. And in terms of, that's part of the closing the data gaps, but at the same time, we also want to work towards translating from these idea of relative risk, low to high, as Jameal was talking about, to more absolute risks, including direction. And part of this includes engaging more with the human dimension sections to ensure that we have the appropriate considerations throughout the entire risk process, and make sure we're examining the right parameters for the ecosystem impact when, you know, these thresholds mentioned previously are reached. One example of this is for the dynamic ocean management work. We do hope to have economic cost built in directly to the tool. So if we knew that reaching a certain cap, whether it's a hard cap or whether just getting close to the take limit of a bycatch species, like a choke species, would result in a fishery closure, there would be a direct economic cost that could be imparted on that event. And then on the last number 3 there, this idea of event-based assessments, obviously this past year and current year has been quite unusual in the California current, at least over the past, since the last large El Nino. But the warm blob being one of the examples, and then, as I mentioned, the current El Nino. And so one of the things we haven't done that directly, but we have discussed, is should there be more risk-based kind of, event-based risk assessments moving forward. Some other examples of this could include river flow management based on rainfall scenarios for the salmon risk assessments, looking at this idea of the fisheries participation network shown here, which would illustrate how effort at a specific port may be redistributed upon a fishery closure. And this is particularly important this year because of the Dungeness crab fishery being closed as a result of harmful algal blooms in large portion of the California current. So you can click ahead next, Jameal. At the same time, just largely due to time, there is still a lot that hasn't been covered. So I wanted to mention a bit of that quickly, just to say it's not that we're not thinking of it, but we didn't have time to get there today. So hopefully there will be more discussion on this. We've hinted at them, but we haven't presented direct results of the additional work being done on the human activities with regards to risk in the CCIA, but there is a good bit of effort being done on this. And there also is the working group that, again, has been mentioned, but we're not presenting the results yet from this ecosystem-based reference points working group. And I'll just say that we hope to have additional materials available, whether it's via the IEA website or additional documents in the near future. But it's something that Jameal and I both are, and Jameal more than me, are working pretty hard at. Also, as part of previous integrated ecosystem assessments, we have focused on climate change risk quite heavily. Another example that didn't get presented was some work on highly migratory species such as tuna and sharks, in addition to protected species relative to climate projections. But this is also going to be a focal risk area for future IEAs. So if there are specific components of the IEA process that are of interest to the Council, that's one area where, with regards to climate change, we're very interested in hearing more about that. And then last but definitely not least, we have not focused much on the management strategy evaluations as part of the IEA process. And in part that's because risk is a much younger portion of the IEA due largely to funding, how funding has come into the center, but management strategy evaluations even more so. And so they are a focal point for upcoming IEA activities, but we have just limited examples for MSCs at the California current-wide scale. So I think this is, you can go ahead and click on to the last slide. Hopefully, yeah, this one works. So we have tried to consider really as many risks as possible when we came down to our screening of the risk results we've included in the IEA, but obviously we haven't looked at the risks of avoiding all risks, and you can see how that's a little bit of an endless spiral potentially. So really what we wanted to end with here is to steal a slogan from UPS and to turn the microphone back to you and ask really what the CCIEA risk section could better focus on to be essentially most of use to the council process. So on behalf of Jameal and myself, thank you very much for tuning in, and obviously we're glad to answer more questions.
Okay, thank you both. So Deb emailed me her question, and I'll ask it. So she was wondering, and of course this goes back a bit in your presentation, but you had the measure of vulnerability to climate change that was based on two indicators, sea surface temperature and chlorophyll A, but in the, I think she must be referring to the graph with X and Y axis. Those are combined into a single metric. So she was just wondering how you take the two indicators and combine them. For example, do you use an average or some other technique to combine those values?
Oh, goody, a real science question. Thanks, Deb. Well, we thought about that a bunch. I think there's probably several ways to do it. What we did is we conducted a principal component analysis on the mean and standard deviation in sea surface temperature and chlorophyll A so that we could address collinearity between those two variables, and then we actually estimated exposure based on the principal component scores. So that was the approach that we thought was most appropriate for this first go at a vulnerability assessment, but I'm definitely open to alternative approaches if you've got ideas.
And this is Elliott, if you guys can hear me. I wanted to toss another example out there that for the HMS, the highly migratory species and protected species analyses we actually used statistical models, specifically generalized additive mixed models, to look at sea surface temperature and chlorophyll together. So that's another kind of additional approach that we can take with regards to looking at potential climate change impacts into the future.
I'm not seeing any hands raised at the moment. And just on cue, Cerise raised her hand. So Cerise, go ahead.
Thank you, Kit. Hopefully others will have questions that come to mind soon as well. But I guess I was wondering how the IEA folks, and particularly Jameal and Elliott, plan to bring these sort of specialized results into the council process. We have the State of the California Current Ecosystem Report that the IEA folks and others within NWFSC produce and provide to the council in a very deliberative way. And being someone who's on the HMS team and CPS, and as well as the ecosystem work group, I'm aware of some of the efforts that you've described here today, particularly with dynamic ocean modeling, just as an example. How that has become involved in the council has largely been the researchers coming and speaking with the advisory bodies and making presentations to the council on their progress and their goals and so forth, and hearing feedback and engaging in that manner, and doing it sort of on the timeline that suits the progress of the work. And is that how you envision coming forward with other results or activities that you're planning to do that you've described today?
I might start and then let Jameal fill in where I've missed. I think the short answer is we're really open to how best to do that. I think we've used a lot of the channels that we've been most familiar with. So as you mentioned, for the dynamic ocean management work, we have been working, had at least somebody at the council presenting as the results move forward. Sadly, a lot of this is very funding dependent and just timing dependent. So that's been, I think, the main thing holding up kind of the speed at which we do this. But we would be very eager to hold, whether it's to hold, additional workshops, again, funding dependent, to see what risk components would be of most use. We would be more than happy, I think, to kind of fill in that way. I don't know if that answers the question directly, but.
Yes, it did, Elliott. I guess I was wondering how you set your priorities, and you kind of alluded to that as well. So that, I guess I see going forward, just speaking for myself, value in having an ongoing dialogue about the activities that you're undertaking and which ones you decide to work upon and whom you work with on developing your work. So thank you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, exactly what you said. I think that's, Jameal said this at the beginning, but I think this webinar approach, hopefully we will have more of these in the future to make sure that our priorities are as best aligned as possible. So again, yeah, thanks for that. And Jameal, I think, had one more thing to add.
Yeah, I agree with everything Elliott said, and thanks for that question. The only thing I would add is that especially for some of these risk assessments that require an understanding of what, say, climate scenario is of interest, or what set of management rules are in place, we start to get to this gray area between what the IEA calls MSE and what it calls risk assessment. And I think that becomes more of a bean counting exercise, and what's important is that we do science that's actually informative to the council process. And so to that end, the way that I've seen these risk assessments best used in a real context is by having an iterative dialogue where, for instance, I might show you something that has a time horizon to the year 2100, and you might say to me, we're not planning for the year 2100, we'd just like to know what's happening at the end of 2016 or 2020 or whatever it is. And so then we could dial back and say, okay, well, what if we borrowed some of the elements that you like from the approach we've used so far on the longer time horizon, but applied it on a much shorter time scale, show you those results, and then maybe you'd say, okay, this is getting closer, but I think we need to have a better understanding of whether vulnerable means a reduction in survival or a shift in geographic distribution. Can we do something there? And we can work back and forth to dial things into what would be most useful. And so I think that's especially true when the framework we're using is one like the one I presented on the coastal pelagic species, which doesn't require the time, financial investment, and the number of people that would be required of a more sophisticated quantitative modeling approach.
Well, thank you, Jameal. All of that sounds good.
I saw that Chris Harvey, you had your hand up a little while ago. Did you have a question or comment?
I wanted to maybe follow up on this, on Cyrese's question too. As far as something I would really like to see come out of this process of the IEA team working with the ecosystem work group and the council advisory teams and bodies is that one of the things that the council asked us to consider, and I think has been wondering about itself, that we heard about at the September meeting, well, the pre-meetings, the pre-council meetings, was that the council is not always entirely sure what to do with the indicators that we present. And I would very much like it if we were able to reserve a couple pages in our State of the California Current report, not just for updating the indicator time series, but for putting risk analyses into maybe the very last section. Because the answer to the question, what can we do with these indicators, one of the answers to that is we can do risk assessment of them and let the council know what kinds of stressors are putting target species or other species of concern more at risk than they might have been otherwise. And this would require a little bit of planning, but that's the whole purpose, I guess, of this interaction that we have. is to know which species are the ones that are most of interest and when the appropriate time for us to provide that information is, if it's at the March meeting or if it's at the June meeting or what have you for the fishery or resource in question. So you've seen several plots that Jameal and Elliott have produced. You know, the technical aspects aside, the plots themselves are fairly straightforward, and they should be fairly easy to connect back to indicator time series that are shown earlier in the state of the current report. So this is putting those indicators into use for the council, in my opinion. We just need to work together, I think, to come up with the right recipe for how to for which ones are most in the council's field of interest at the moment.
Corey, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Wow, you noticed that fast, kid. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so Jameal, maybe this is for you, and I guess this is similar, coming at a different, same question, maybe with a different angle from that Cerese's. I guess one of the philosophies behind the risk-based way of thinking that's built into the IEA is you do a, you spoke about iteration, but you take kind of quick, pretty simple or less difficult analyses, looking at what the next questions you should be paying most attention to, and then do more focused analyses on your biggest risk. That's kind of like, that's the guiding philosophy here. So are you guys getting at that made you think that the climate change, you've seen enough from this climate change, forage fish, risk analysis, that you think that is kind of pointing us towards, the council towards something we should be investigating further, or is it more just a demonstration of how we can get the iterative process worked into the council better? So I guess to restate the question, is this, have you seen that this is one of the biggest risks we should be paying attention to, or that maybe it's more of a demonstration to get things working?
Yeah, good question. I think that I haven't been authorized to speak on behalf of the agency, and so I'll just limit my comments to my thoughts on that, which are there's currently, the West Coast is pulling together a 5-year climate strategy plan, and as part of that, I think one of the things that will be proposed are a few species that seem like the most likely candidates to dig in and develop more quantitative, rigorous models to look at the influence of both near and longer-term climatic change. And so I would be very surprised if climate vulnerability analyses like the one I presented here and those that are being done for groundfish, HMS, and so forth weren't used to inform those decisions. And I'd be surprised if those decisions weren't made in collaboration with conversations with the council and associated bodies. So at this point, there's been no sort of top-down direction of where to dig in, and we haven't, the work I presented here is nearly ready for submission, but still needs another round of reviews from my co-authors before it's ready for prime time. So we're just not there yet. So in other words, this is a really good time for input.
This is Yvonne. I had a couple questions, but I also wanted to sort of reflect back on something that Chris had said, asking about reserving a couple of pages in the annual report for discussing risk analyses. And I think that's a good idea, to have something added on so that we could establish the report as a sort of ongoing dialogue between the management side and the science side. Some of the I guess, implied in Jameal and Elliott's and stated outright in their presentation is we're going to have to do a lot of on communication and making sure that the managers and scientists understand each other. And I'm thinking about my question earlier on coastal pelagic species and whether the vulnerability meant negatively affected, and if so, in what way. And Jameal responded that it was more sort of the dramatic level of the reaction of these species to climate change, and it could be positive or negative. And so I think we're going to have to, the word risk implies negative, and I think we have to make sure that we educate people about what a risk analysis is and what it means, and whether vulnerability means positive or negative, because the council really has to make its decisions not just on whether there's a reaction to some input, but on whether the reaction is positive or negative. So that's a rambling way of saying I think we can reserve a section of the report for discussions and questions between scientists and managers. We just have to be clear that we're asking questions.
So I see that Anthony Shao has his hand up, and I've unmuted you, so you could go ahead.
Awesome. So along the same vein, my question is, have you guys been kind of gearing your modeling effort and approach towards existing council scientific processes and components like the stock synthesis? So like when a reaction does occur, it can be transferred to a format that the council regulatory process can actually recognize without, an extra months, if not a year, set aside time to try and do that process separately.
Mention quickly, I think Jameal may have more to add, but I think that the control rule approach that Jameal presented at the beginning with regards to SST and sardines might be the first step at this, because we don't have good enough mechanistic understanding of exactly how all of these indicators might translate to the stock recruitment process. But we do at least, we're at least getting to the point where we can start to say whether they can bring in more need for precautionary approach versus not, based on their response to a lot of these environmental and ecological drivers. So I think I would just say that while we're looking towards that as the goal, I think there are a few more steps, or I think there's more dialogue needed to get to the point to make sure that we're doing it in the way we can of best use to the stock synthesis process.
Cool. Thank you so much.
If others don't have questions, or if you don't mind my jumping in, something that we've heard a lot about from our different advisory bodies, and we've sort of heard about in the news, is ocean acidification and a lot of studies on invertebrates. And I'm wondering if you have heard of anything happening in terms of looking at the effects of ocean acidification on finfish species, and whether that's going to be any part of the IEA, whether it's an issue, so that we can think about sort of what are the cumulative risks of that increasing over time.
So let me say something, and if Elliott has anything to add, he's free to do so, and anybody else on the IEA team. The first thing that jumps to mind when it comes to looking at vulnerability due to ocean acidification that's being conducted as part of by the IEA team is work that Melissa Poe, an anthropologist, is leading, focused on the vulnerability of tribes in Washington to ocean acidification based on how they use and rely upon marine resources. And so that includes finfish, but isn't limited to that. And that work is ongoing, and it's an interesting interdisciplinary approach that relies on a combination of interviews with people as well as an assessment of expected effects of species to increasingly acidic waters. The other thing that comes to mind is work that a graduate student at University of Washington led. Her name's Emma Hodgson, in collaboration with Isaac Kaplan, Tim Essington, and others that I'm forgetting at this point. And that focuses on an exposure sensitivity type framework looking at life stage specific risk to ocean acidification. It included assessments for species like Dungeness crab and Pacific hake. I'm forgetting the others, but maybe somebody else can help me out here. And I believe that work is in review for publication now and is probably included in the last report and available on the IEA website, but maybe Chris or Toby or somebody can help me out there.
Yeah, Emma's work, I believe, is available in the IEA report, and I'm just looking up real quickly what other species besides Dungeness crab and hake. She also looked at krill, pink shrimp, and then some completely non-target species. So krill as a forage for target species, pink shrimp and Dungeness crab as alternative target species to federally managed fisheries that certainly would be influencing the amount of effort that went into a federally managed fishery, and also hake. Then I do know that there are experimental projects going on. It escapes me at the moment where they're being done, but there are certainly active laboratory exposure experiments going on with young life history stages of rockfish. And from what I've heard, the preliminary results coming out of those are that that pH, perhaps more than some of the other variables associated with ocean acidification, is affecting young rockfish sense of smell, which apparently makes them less able to detect predators. And it actually makes them a little bit more bold, so they'll go, move around a little bit more than they would ordinarily. All of which could be, potentially expose them to predation to a different extent than they currently are. But that work is still ongoing, and it's not part of the IEA directly, because the IEA, for the most part, is not a fresh new data collection group. We more are an assimilation group of other people's work, but we're certainly following that kind of research.
Yeah, I believe that is work that Sue Sogard is leading on the NIMP side of things at the Southwest Center in Santa Cruz. And the other thing that occurs to me is that there's been discussion about developing an ocean acidification indicator. I believe the Alaska Center is using something like this based on pteropod vulnerability to acidic waters, and so I know there's been a dialogue about that. Kelly Andrews might be the best person to speak to where we are in that process. Last thing I'll say is that we're very open to input about where it would be most useful to focus attention on looking at potential effects of ocean acidification.
This is completely random and a minor detail, but you said pteropod, and that reminded me. There was some interest, Cerise, do you recall this? I think from either the Coastal Pelagic Management Team or the advisory panel on having, just wondering whether a pteropod abundance indicator would be useful. Sorry, this is a small thing, but.
I don't recall the specifics, Yvonne, but I do know that, in Oregon, we've also identified pteropods as one of the key species that's most likely affected by ocean acidification. So maybe it is kind of an indicator species. But I personally haven't looked into it in any detail or anything.
So yeah, pteropods were the other group that Emma was looking at, and pteropods abundance is monitored on Bill Peterson's Newport line, possibly other places too, but Bill is very definitely making sure that he gets counts of those. And then our colleagues at the Pacific Marine Ecosystem Lab, or Environmental Lab rather, at Sandpoint that do, these are the oceanographers that do cruises down the West Coast a couple times a year. They are very interested in pteropod shell condition and are doing shipboard experiments on those as they go. So we are definitely interested in the use of pteropods as a potential indicator as well. And if that is something that, pteropods are very unlikely to be an important food source for virtually anything in the California current, but they are certainly a canary in the coal mine as far as OA goes. So if that is something that you would like to see in the report going forward, we can definitely muster our resources around that one.
Okay, so do we have any questions from members of other advisory bodies or members of the public? I don't want to have people feeling like they don't have a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, maybe I could just, Chris Harvey again, maybe I could just throw out something for those folks that if Elliott, I believe, toward the end of the presentation alluded to other human activities that are that we're monitoring, and if there are folks within specific management teams or advisory bodies or whatnot that are particularly concerned about certain other human activities outside of fishing or climate or anything like that too, and they want to bring those to our attention, we'd certainly be interested to know about them.
I don't see any hands raised. So just a reminder, if you do want to ask a question or make a comment, raise your hand. I'll unmute you.
And this is Yvonne. I had another wild and random thought, which was just, it sounds like on the dynamic ocean management issue question, it sounds like you're working closely with some of the HMS managers, which is great. I think their fisheries management has different abilities to be nimble or not, depending on our various legal requirements. So as you're thinking about and dreaming up dynamic ocean management regimes, let's try to talk with each other about what is and isn't possible. Some things are possible. I would say in some of our fisheries, like in the salmon fisheries, we have very rapidly changing management in season, but in others not so much. So there are things that we can change quickly and others that we can't, and then there are processes, overall processes that would have to be changed in order to implement more, I guess, swiftly changing management measures. And it would be helpful to have conversations with you guys about whatever it is you're dreaming up there.
Yep, fully agree. This is Elliott, and I just wanted to say that one of the real strengths of the dynamic ocean management approach that we've been taking, and before we undertook the process, we did more of a kind of a review in the U.S., and one of the advantages of it is there doesn't have to be any legal teeth or any kind of management framework forcing it to be used, but instead can be used as a tool voluntarily by the fishers so that it's very light and quick and nimble, kind of as you mentioned. And so there's a lot of different levels of implementation, and we would be more than happy, more than eager to discuss further some of the best opportunities for this moving forward.
Richard Scully, you have your hand up. Go ahead. I took you off mute on my end. We can't hear you, Richard. I'm not sure if you're on mute on your end, but give it a try.
Okay. Well, Richard, if you'd either send an email to someone or if you're able to speak up, please do so, but we can't hear you. Does anyone else have any other questions before we wrap things up?
Hey, this is Corey from Washington again. A question for Elliott, kind of a smaller picture question. You might have mentioned it too, but I know there's been a lot of interest at the council in the, man, I just blanked on the name, but basically the dynamic models you're using to look at swordfish and sea turtles and bycatch. And you've mentioned the challenge of funding. What exactly is the funding needed? Is it for the data collection, like the remote sensing, or is it for the analysts? I'm sure the council's heard this many times, but for those of us who can't remember or haven't heard, what is the what areas are really needed for funding in that project?
Very good question, and I mean I'd say the short answer is that personnel time ends up being the largest one. Many of these models require pretty intensive validation to make sure that we're not predicting, leatherback sea turtles in the Great Lakes, for example. Obviously not that bad, but nonetheless, a lot of the processing and analysis takes, I'd say, the biggest part of the time. That being said, there definitely are ongoing needs for monitoring too, because if you were predicting these habitats and folks are going out and using our predictions and still catching bycatch at high rates, we need that to feed back into our model so that we improve it kind of moving forward. The last part I'll say, and I think this is in some ways, I won't say the most exciting, but one of the more exciting ways is we are also working on app development, so we could have mobile apps that would deliver this via iPhone or Android, and that becomes really important to make sure both that the data are available when you're out at sea, at least within cell coverage, but also that hopefully the data delivery platform also can serve as a data input platform so that some of these aspects can kind of feed back towards us for validation. All that to be said that, we are actively, and it's not something where we're sitting on our laurels. While we're doing the work, we are actively looking for funding to kind of keep this going, because we do recognize, particularly with the DGN, the driftgill net fleet right now, this is a priority action item, and it is something we've really put towards the top of our agenda for that reason, given the timeliness with experimental fishing permits and things like that. We want to do whatever we can to support the sustainability and economic viability of the fishery.
Richard, you want to give it another try?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Can hear you now.
You do hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I was curious about indicators that best demonstrate the status of the current state of climate change. I mean, there are things that are changing, but I don't know if there's a link to climate change, such as seems like the increased incidence of hazardous algal blooms, or the disappearance of starfish. Are there what are the indicators that people besides increase or decreasing pH. Are there risk factors that are real obvious that changes are occurring and could be used to make the council more aware or concerned about the issue?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think that in terms of the indicators, most of the indicators we have in the IEA are not collected over a long enough time series to really be able to separate the scales of decadal climate variability from the secular long-term climate change. That being said, one of the ways we've done that is there are, particularly for the Southern California Bight, data sets like Cal Coffee that do allow us to really go back in time and look at these changes and differences. And there are some really good papers, for example, by Stephen Bograd on oxygen content in Southern California Bight waters that highlight some of the long-term changes that might be occurring. So I think some of the hypoxia is a really good indicator, especially low oxygen in the source waters, as to what we might be seeing in the future. That being said, there isn't one silver bullet that really provides a good indicator, and I think it will take this kind of iterative approach moving forward to identify where we see the ecosystem reference points that might be able to tell us when we've passed kind of that secular change moving forward. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. I see a couple more hands raised, Charisse and Corey. But before I turn to you all, I see an email that Deb sent since her audio is not working. And so I'll ask on behalf of her this question, and it relates to the dynamic ocean management techniques. She was curious whether you are able to access VMS data, and I guess I would add that implies also, would that be a useful data source for input into the dynamic ocean management modeling effort?
And currently, as part of our dynamic ocean management framework, we've relied on observer data from the observer coverage of the fishery, but I would say that VMS data would be incredibly useful, particularly when I was giving the examples of how we model habitat of species in near real time. We could turn a lot of our static risk maps, or at least static use maps, into more dynamic use maps using something like VMS data as we move forward. So yeah, I would definitely be interested in chatting more with folks. I know Jameal has done some analysis with VMS data, but that's not something that we have been focused on as much yet, but would like to be.
One thing I'll add to that, because it's a really good idea, is that our experience working with the VMS data is that trying to move too fast to make inferences from it is a dangerous way to go. There's been a tremendous amount, as in years, of work that's gone into the QC and QA that we've done on VMS data, and we're just getting to a point where we feel comfortable using VMS tracks to say, yep, that was a tuna fishing trip, and this is where it was in relation to oceanographic conditions and so forth. That's really exciting work, but I think this is an experience that folks that have been working on VMS data in the Gulf of Mexico, up in Alaska, and here in the California Current have had. So I think that is a really good one to keep in mind for the horizon, especially if it's of interest to you guys.
Okay, well, I'm not sure whose hand was up first, but Charisse, go ahead, then followed by Corey.
Thank you, Kit. And first off, before too many people leave the webinars, I do want to thank the folks who presented today, as well as all the other presenters and all of the folks, and there must be quite a large number of them who've participated and continue to participate in developing all the information in the IEA products and analyses that we've seen to date and will see in the future. So I just want to say thanks for making that effort. And my comment relates really in terms of trying to reciprocate in kind in some measure. The ecosystem work group, following one of the recent ones, maybe the last webinar series, discussed providing some guidance to the advisory bodies at the council on kinds of information or thoughts and comments that they may have that would be most useful in continuing the dialogue that has begun here and giving feedback that's useful to the IEA folks. And in thinking about how to do that, I'm struck with the large number of possibilities that members of the advisory bodies may have for things they'd like to see produced or analyses done, and a lot of tantalizing opportunities coming in the future. So I guess I'm trying to figure out, is there value in the advisory bodies identifying maybe their top 2 or 3 management needs going forward, maybe near term, long term, or just leave it open-ended in terms of the kinds of information they would foresee being useful in the management or fisheries for those species. So if you have any thoughts that would be most helpful to you to prioritize the kinds of things that you are capable of doing given funding and personnel and the degree of research and information that you've developed so far, do you have any thoughts you would like to offer on that?
Was that question targeted at Jameal and myself or the council first? Sorry, I missed that.
Sorry, I was thinking Jameal and well, any of the presenters, Chris, Elliott, whomever.
Yeah, so this is Elliott. I think your point, I mean, the more prioritization we can get, and part of the goal of this was to kind of present a suite of approaches we can take, and I think we would be very interested, I mean, beyond interested in a prioritization as to which aspects would be kind of most of use from the council. I mean, just off the top of my head, one thing that's clearly come up is that perhaps we need to do a better job in our State of the California Current reports pulling together indicators of climate variability and change in a package that would, highlight some of these kind of potential leading indicators towards what's happening in the California Current. So this already has provided a good bit of prioritization in my mindset, but I think the more the merrier.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, I would just add that one of the things that we had to do was pull together a 3-year plan and as part of the, for the whole IEA. And so in developing that for the risk assessment section, I think there's maybe 3 broad categories that we were thinking about working within, and from there, it's wide open. So those categories are developing ecosystem-based reference points at appropriate spatial and temporal scales for different partners, including the council. The second one is community vulnerability assessments. So this is really where our human dimensions team comes in and starts to think about how changes in the ocean affect people in coastal communities. And then finally, the work that Elliott presented on dynamic ocean management, and definitely with attention to Yvonne's point about making sure we think carefully and have an ongoing dialogue about which approaches will allow for nimble management responses and which ones are interesting and cool but a little bit unrealistic.
Yeah. Thanks.
And then this is Chris Harvey, just to follow up on what Elliott and Jameal said. The prioritization of or top 2 or 3 management needs would be amazing. I think we find ourselves a lot of times in the place of hoping that we're doing a good job of providing things that the council might be interested in, and hoping to do things that might be interesting is not really going to cut it. And it inevitably ends up with a lot of the products that the IEA produces being more interesting, like in an academic, chin-scratching kind of sense, rather than in a hands-on applied sense. And the hands-on applied is definitely what we want to be able to provide. And until we're getting the definitions of those terms from the council and from other management bodies that we're partnering with, we're always going to be providing science that's slightly more gee whiz than it is hands-on applicable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Okay,
Okay,
Corey,
well, That was an awesome sum up. I don't know if there's any sort of final thoughts or questions, and I'm sorry, I think I may have just interrupted anyone or someone.
Yeah, Corey has his hand up. Go ahead, Corey.
Me, Corey? So I must have just been stretching, but yeah, I think I raised it earlier, but since I'm talking, yeah, I will echo Teresa's thanks to everyone. And just to comment on that is a good wrap up. I don't want to unwrap it, but I think I got a question I had in my mind. The earlier question I asked is like, how could you guys, how can these risk-based tools point us towards what our priorities should be, and put that out there for you guys to think about. Because it sounds like to me what we're still. This has been a great conversation, but it just keeps underscoring the need to get more iteration, interaction going on with you analysts and advisors we have at the council.
Corey, let me just make sure I'm understanding your question. Is it about which risk-based tools would be most useful for council processes, or was it something else?
Sorry, let me be clear. And sorry for being confused. Is there more here? A question to think about from here on out is I kind of see we have a back and forth of you guys want to know what the council's management needs are. We kind of want to know what it is you can do, and now we have a better idea. And I guess one of the risk-based ways of thinking is to use a tool to help you see what your management needs are. So all I'm saying is I see even more than at the start of this that there is a need for more dialogue on as you guys are saying, you guys need to hear more from the council and its advisors, and I think people still have questions about what it is you can help us do to identify which management needs are most are ready to be addressed by the tools you guys have. So just more. I'm saying I think we need more time to have the dialogue.
That's great, and we will continue to produce different example products, I think, and then pay close attention to the ones where we sense there's a real bite from you guys and others.
Just so it's kind of on the record, I suppose. Presently, what the IEA team plans to do each year is to attend the pre-council meetings and the beginning of the council meeting, if necessary, in both March and in September. And if it turns out that there are certain advisory teams or management teams and advisory bodies that meet regularly in those months and would like to talk to us, then it would be terrific to formally open up lines of dialogue there. If there are other management teams and advisory groups that don't happen to meet regularly in those months, or their agendas are already predictably quite full, and there's some other time that would be good to meet, we can certainly try to adjust and set aside travel funds so that those opportunities can be realized as well. But more dialogue, certainly, we're all in favor of that. Another thing that's kind of fortunate is while we've used these webinars to roll out some of the capabilities we have, I feel like the general ecosystem science world that produces the kind of science that has been presented in these webinars, it's actually a fairly small community. And if there are tools that we don't necessarily use right now, I don't feel like it would be terribly difficult for us to track down those tools and figure out how to use them. I'm speaking on behalf of the rest of the team, certainly not on my own behalf, because quantitative things aren't my bag. But there are a lot of people in the team that are quite good at it, and know other people that are quite good at it that might be using different tools. So if there are priorities that the council has, I think it's more important to identify what those priorities are, and then we'll figure out if we have the tools or if someone else has tools that we can, adapt to get those priorities addressed.
Okay, well, I would like to, this is Yvonne again, I just want to thank first Jameal and Elliott for talking with us today about some work that is a little bit on the far horizon for what we've seen in the past, and also to thank Chris and Toby for setting this up and getting everyone involved in speaking. And we really appreciate not just the folks who have been giving us presentations, but also everyone at the Science Centers who's shown up to the webinars and maybe answered questions that they had not expected to answer on different days. And so this has been an enormous effort on the Center's behalf, and we wanted to thank you for going to all that trouble for us. And so I think unless, I don't know if other ecosystem work group members have any sort of final thoughts, if the ecosystem work group could just hold on and on the line to see if we have any logistical discussions we want to have over getting our reports ready for the council, then let's do that. And otherwise, I think we can let everyone else go. So this is my last call to see if anyone from the ecosystem work group has any sort of final thoughts or summaries or what have you before we let folks go. Okay, thanks again, everyone. You're welcome to stay on the line if you want to hear us talk about who's going to work on which paragraph of our report, but